The winter of 1946 arrived in New York City like a returning soldier, bruised, grateful, and desperate to forget the past. World War II had ended just 6 months prior, and America was drunk on victory. The city's streets overflowed with servicemen in uniform, confetti still clung to the gutters of Times Square, and a peculiar optimism gripped the nation. For most Americans, this was a time of celebration, of building new lives, of moving forward into a prosperous future. But in the shadowed backrooms and smoky basements of Lower Manhattan, in the private offices hidden behind legitimate business fronts, and in the exclusive establishments where the truly powerful gathered, a different kind of war was unfolding. While the common people celebrated peace, the architects of America's underworld were engaged in a delicate, lethal game of reorganization, a chess match where every piece represented flesh and blood, and every move could result in bodies in the East River. The man at the center of this transformation was named Charles Salvatore Lucania, known to the world as Lucky Luciano. His story was unlike any other in organized crime, for Luciano represented something revolutionary: the modernization of the American mafia. Where his predecessors had ruled through brute force and regional fiefdoms, Luciano had envisioned something far more sophisticated. He imagined a national syndicaton, organized network of crime families that could operate with corporate efficiency, eliminate wasteful territorial wars, and maximize profit through coordinated enterprise. Lucky Luciano had spent the last 9 years imprisoned in Dannemora, a maximum security facility in upstate New York that was little more than a tomb of concrete and despair. His imprisonment had come in 1936, the result of a vice conviction that carried a 30 to 50-year sentence. But in 1942, as World War II raged across 2 oceans, the United States Navy faced a crisis. German U-boats were systematically destroying American merchant shipping in the Atlantic, and intelligence suggested that Nazi agents were infiltrating the docks of New York Harbor, sabotaging war materials destined for the European theater. The government, in an act of desperation that would become one of history's most controversial decisions, approached the imprisoned Luciano with an offer. He controlled the Italian immigrant networks that dominated the waterfronts of New York. He had the connections, the influence, and the reach to ensure security of the docks. If he would use his position to provide this service to protect American war supplies and prevent sabotage, his sentence would be commuted. Luciano, ever the businessman, saw opportunity in his country's desperation. He agreed. The arrangement worked. During the war years, Luciano's associates, men like Meyer Lansky and Vito Genovese, ensured that the docks remained secure and productive. Union corruption was controlled. Potential security breaches were eliminated. The shipment of war materials continued uninterrupted. Luciano had, in effect, helped the American government win the war, even if through methods and associations that no official could openly acknowledge. But victory came with a price. The deal included a clause that Luciano had not initially emphasized: deportation. Upon release from prison, he would be immediately deported to Italy, his country of birth. He would not be allowed to remain in the United States. The irony was almost poetic. Luciano had just saved his country from enemy sabotage, and his reward was exile. On February 3, 1946, Lucky Luciano walked out of Dannemora for the last time. But he did not go directly to the docks for deportation. He had business to conduct. He had 3 weeks to solidify his empire, to ensure that his vision of organized crime would survive his absence, and to address the one major piece of the puzzle that remained unsolved: Harlem. The numbers racket in Harlem was something that had to be understood in its proper context. It was far more than simple, illegal gambling. The numbers game, a daily lottery where residents could bet small amounts on 3-digit combinations that would be drawn each afternoon, was woven into the fabric of Harlem's community. Street vendors sold numbers, tickets, alongside newspapers. Churches had members who played doormen, nurses, teachers, and shopkeepers all participated in what was essentially an informal tax on hope. For a dime, or a quarter, or sometimes just a nickel, a person could dream. They could imagine what might happen if their number came in, and on the days when it did, the payouts were real. The runners, young men, usually teenagers, who sold the tickets and collected the money, became neighborhood celebrities. The numbers bankers, the men who managed the operations, accumulated wealth and power that rivaled legitimate businessmen. and the community itself developed an ecosystem around the game. Money circulated, runners fed their families, buildings got renovated, community organizations received anonymous donations. By 1946, the Harlem Numbers racket was generating an estimated $60 to $70 million annually. This was not small money. This was empire-building money. This was the kind of revenue stream that could make a man, or a family, or a criminal organization genuinely wealthy. And here was the problem. Everyone wanted it. In 1935, a man named Dutch Schultz had wanted it too. Schultz was a formidable criminal in his own right, ruthless, intelligent, and connected to powerful forces in Tammany Hall, the corrupt political machine that dominated New York City. Schultz believed that with sufficient force, he could muscle into Harlem and take control of the numbers operation. He was confident in a way that only powerful men and fools can be. He sent his enforcers into Harlem with the expectation that local operators would capitulate. They didn't. A quiet man emerged to meet Schultz's challenge. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, but everyone called him Bumpy, a nickname derived from a distinctive bump on his head that he'd acquired in childhood. Unlike Schultz, who announced his intentions with guns and swagger, Bumpy Johnson operated in a different register entirely. He was methodical, he was intelligent, and he understood something fundamental about power that Schultz, in his arrogance, had completely missed. Power rooted only in violence is always fragile. Power rooted in community, respect, and mutual benefit is nearly unbreakable. When Schultz made his move, Bumpy Johnson didn't immediately resort to violence. Instead, he consolidated the Harlem Numbers operations under a unified structure. He built relationships with police, not through bribes alone, but through arrangements that benefited officers and departments. He became, in effect, the administrator of a shadow government in Harlem, controlling vice, managing disputes, distributing wealth in ways that earned him the loyalty and respect of the community. By 1940, Schultz was dead. He'd been murdered in a New Jersey restaurant, shot multiple times in what became known as one of the signature mob killings of the era. The consensus among organized crime insiders was that Schultz's attempt to take Harlem had been the final miscalculation that cost him his life. But what few people realized, what Bumpy had been careful to ensure, was that while Schultz had made enemies across multiple crime families, the final blow came from his refusal to respect Harlem, his contempt for the black community he'd tried to conquer, and his fundamental misunderstanding of how power actually worked. For 11 years after Schultz's death, Bumpy Johnson had operated the Harlem Numbers racket virtually unopposed. He'd built something remarkable, not just a criminal enterprise, but an institution. He employed hundreds of runners. He had relationships with judges, district attorneys, and police commissioners. He'd become a figure of respect in Harlem, a man who could be approached by anyone with a problem, a man whose word was considered bond. This was the situation that Lucky Luciano inherited as he prepared to leave America. The Italian families wanted Harlem. The money was too substantial to ignore. But Luciano, unlike many of his predecessors, understood the lessons of Schultz's failure. You cannot simply take Harlem. Harlem has to want to do business with you. The community has to accept the arrangement. And the man who controls Harlem has to consent. Which meant that Lucky Luciano, the man who'd unified the 5 families and restructured American organized crime, had to negotiate with Bumpy Johnson, a black man from a world that was almost entirely separate from Luciano's own. In the rigid hierarchical structure of 1946, America segregated by law in the South and by custom everywhere else. This was an extraordinary thing. But Luciano had built his empire by being pragmatic. If pragmatism required sitting at a table with Bumpy Johnson, then Luciano would sit. On February 10, 1946, Luciano sent word. He wanted a meeting. The message was conveyed through intermediaries, men who worked in both worlds, who understood both the Italian hierarchy and the Harlem power structure. The message was simple: let's talk. Bumpy Johnson did not respond immediately. This was deliberate. For an entire week, Luciano waited. He waited while the clock counted down toward his deportation. He waited while his associates whispered about whether Bumpy would show, whether this arrangement was even possible. In that week of waiting, something important happened. Luciano learned something about Bumpy Johnson. The man did not rush toward power. The man did not scramble to meet with the most important criminal in America. The man took his time, considered his options, and moved only when he was ready. That silence told Luciano everything he needed to know. This was not going to be easy. The Stork Club occupied an exclusive spot on East 53rd Street in Midtown Manhattan. It was not simply a nightclub, it was an institution of American power and glamour. Frank Sinatra performed there when he was in the city. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, maintained a regular table where he could drink and socialize with the very people his agency was theoretically investigating. Celebrities rubbed shoulders with politicians. Wealthy businessmen conducted deals over champagne. The Stork Club existed in a strange intersection between legitimacy and illicit power, a place where everyone knew the rules and no one asked uncomfortable questions. On the evening of February 18, 1946, Lucky Luciano made a phone call. He reserved the entire VIP room for a private party. He arrived at 8 o'clock in the evening, dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit with a silk tie and pocket square. He brought 6 men with him. First was Frank Costello, his acting boss, and the man who had held the Luciano family together during his imprisonment. Costello was intelligent, measured, and deeply connected to political power. Next was Albert Anastasia, the man known throughout the underworld as the Lord High Executioner, a title that described both his role and his temperament. Anastasia was a killer, a direct line of violence. Then there was Meyer Lansky, the accountant, the man who understood numbers and banking and how to move money through legitimate channels. Lansky was perhaps the most brilliant strategist in organized crime, the man who had helped Luciano architect the National Syndicate. The other 3 were bodyguards, men selected for their absolute loyalty and their willingness to use violence without hesitation. Each had killed more men than most people would meet in a lifetime. Each carried weapons concealed in holsters and jacket linings. Each had the cold eyes of a professional. They took positions in the VIP room, a space isolated from the rest of the club, accessible only through a private entrance, decorated with expensive furniture and original artwork. The men settled into their seats, Luciano at the head of the table, flanked by Costello and Anastasia, with Lansky to his right and the 3 bodyguards distributed strategically around the perimeter. Then they waited. Bumpy Johnson arrived at 9 o'clock. He came alone. This was significant. While Luciano had brought 6 men and bodyguards, Bumpy walked into the most dangerous room in New York, accompanied only by himself. He was 40 years old, with a medium build and sharp features. He was dressed in a tailored 3-piece suit of navy blue, the jacket cut perfectly to his frame. His white shirt was crisp and clean, the creases precise. Noticeably, he wore no Taya-style choice that said something about his refusal to conform to certain conventions. A gold watch chain hung from his vest pocket, connecting to a timepiece of obvious quality. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His hair was freshly barbered, the edges clean and sharp. In his right hand, he carried a leather briefcase, expensive and well-maintained. Everything about his appearance conveyed the same message. I am a man of substance. I am a man of respect. I am not here to beg. As he entered the room, the bodyguards immediately moved toward him, hands drifting toward the weapons beneath their jackets. But before anything escalated, Luciano raised one hand, a single gesture. Let him through. The bodyguards stood down. Bumpy Johnson walked past them without acknowledging their presence, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. He approached the table where the 7 men sat. His eyes moved across them, Costello, Anastasia, Lansker, entering each face, each position, each detail. Then, without hesitation, without asking permission, without showing deference, Bumpy pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the boss, the position of supreme authority at any negotiating table, and sat down. He placed his briefcase on the table in front of him. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a cigar. He lit it with a gold lighter, took a long drag, and blew the smoke toward the ceiling. For a moment, the room was absolutely silent. Costello's jaw tightened. His hand moved slightly, as if considering whether to stand up. Anastasia's hand drifted toward his waistband, his fingers hovering near a concealed weapon. The 3 bodyguards shifted their weight, preparing for violence. This was an outrageous breach of protocol. In the world of organized crime, the seating arrangement at a negotiating table was never casual. It was a statement of hierarchy, of respect, of power. Bumpy Johnson had just announced, without speaking a single word, that he did not recognize Luciano's superiority. He did not acknowledge the Italian hierarchy. He would sit at the head of the table or nowhere at all. Lucky Luciano stared at Bumpy Johnson for what felt like an eternity. And then, slowly, a genuine smile spread across his face, because Luciano, in that moment, understood exactly what was happening. This was not disrespect. This was a test. Bumpy Johnson was establishing the terms of the conversation before anyone said a word. He was demonstrating, through a simple gesture, that he was an equal, not a subordinate. He was showing that he would not be intimidated by Luciano's power or reputation. He was communicating that whatever deal was made at this table would be negotiated between partners, not dictated by a superior to an inferior. Luciano slowly stood up. He moved around the table and took the seat directly across from Bumpy Johnson. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at the black man sitting across from him with what appeared to be a combination of respect and genuine interest. Then he began to speak. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming." Bumpy took another drag from his cigar. He exhaled slowly, deliberately. He let the silence sit for a moment before responding. "Mr. Luciano, you wanted to talk, so talk." Luciano nodded. He did not seem bothered by the brusqueness. If anything, he seemed approving. He folded his hands on the table and began to explain his situation. "I'm leaving the country in 3 weeks," he said. His voice was measured and calmed, the voice of a man who had negotiated with presidents and criminals and understood the difference between the two, which was often negligible. "The federal government is deporting me back to Italy. I have no choice in the matter. But before I go, I need to make sure that New York remains stable. Stable means no wars. Stable means no chaos. Stable means business continues as it has been, with everyone making money and everyone respecting the boundaries that have been established." Bumpy listened. His face remained impassive. He said nothing. "The 5 families are in order," Luciano continued. "Frank Costello is managing my family in my absence. The other families have their leadership established. The docks are secure. The unions are managed. The political connections are in place. Everything is functioning according to plan." Luciano paused. He leaned forward slightly, his intensity increasing. "Except for one piece, Harlem. The numbers racket is making millions every week, real millions. My people want access to that revenue. For 11 years, since Dutch Schultz failed in his attempt, we've allowed you to run the operation independently. But I'm leaving. New leadership is coming. And the new leadership won't be as patient or as understanding as I have been. They're going to push, they're going to want what they want. And that push is going to create conflict." Bumpy set his cigar down in a crystal ashtray. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Luciano. "You've been running Harlem since Schultz died," Luciano said. "You've got the trust of the community. You've got the infrastructure in place. You've got the police on your payroll. You've got runners, bankers, and a system that works. You're making a fortune, and you're doing it without interference from my families." Luciano shifted in his seat. His voice took on a tone that was almost paternal, almost friendly. "I'm not here to take what's yours, Bumpy. I'm not here to muscle in or to threaten. I'm here to offer you a partnership, a real partnership. You keep running Harlem exactly as you have been. You maintain the operation. You collect the money. You manage the community relationships. You do everything you've been doing. My families provide something different. We provide protection at the highest levels. We provide investment capital if you need to expand. We provide legal connections when your runners get arrested. We provide banking infrastructure to help you move money safely." Luciano paused for effect. "In return, we take 40% of the profits." The room was completely silent. Costello was watching Bumpy's reaction carefully. Lansky's fingers drummed softly on the tabla, nervous habit. Anastasia had straightened up slightly, as if bracing for a response. The 3 bodyguards remained motionless, but their eyes were alert, prepared for anything. Bumpy took another drag from his cigar. He did not respond immediately. He let the silence stretch. Then, in a quiet voice, he asked, "What happens if I say no?" Luciano's smile didn't disappear, but something changed in his eyes. The warmth drained away. They became cold, almost reptilian. When he spoke, his voice carried a different quality. Not angry, not heated, but something far more dangerous, absolute certainty. "Then we have a problem," he said quietly. "Because if you're not with us, Bumpy, you're against us. And nobody survives being against us. Not because we're monsters, not because we enjoy violence, but because we cannot afford to allow defiance. The moment one man says no and survives, the entire system collapses. Other men see that it's possible to refuse us. Other families begin to doubt our authority, and chaos spreads. So, if you're against us, we will destroy you. Not to punish you, to maintain order. It was said without anger. It was said without heat or passion. It was stated as a simple fact, the way one might explain gravity or the rotation of the earth, and that, paradoxically, made it more terrifying than any threat that could have been screamed across the table. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Bumpy Johnson set his cigar down very carefully in the crystal ashtray. He opened his leather briefcase. He reached inside and withdrew a single photograph. He did not show it to anyone. He simply slid it across the table toward Lucky Luciano. Luciano picked it up. His face remained impassive, but his fingers tightened around the edges of the photograph. Beside him, Costello leaned forward, trying to see the image. Anastasia's entire body went rigid. The photograph showed a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn. It was clearly one of the locations Anastasia used for his gambling operations, the architectural style, the location on the waterfront, the trucks parked outside, all indicated an organized gambling enterprise. But the focus of the photograph was on what was happening in front of the warehouse. Albert Anastasia was shaking hands with a man in a police uniform, not a beat cop, a captain, a commander. The kind of handshake that suggested ongoing arrangement, mutual benefit, a relationship of significance. That was taken 3 days ago, Bumpy said quietly. I've got 12 more, just like it. Different warehouses, different cops, different members of your organization, police captains, assistant district attorneys, judges. I've got photographs of your people making deals, taking payments, establishing protection arrangements. The room went deathly quiet. Costello's hand moved toward his jacket, his fingers moving with the intention of reaching for a weapon. Anastasia stood up halfway out of his chair, his face flushing with rage. One of the bodyguards took a step forward, but Luciano simply stared at the photograph, his expression unreadable. Are you threatening me? Luciano asked. His voice was so quiet that it was almost a whisper. No, Bumpy said. I'm showing you respect, because I could have sent these photographs to the district attorney. I could have sent them to the newspapers. I could have burned your entire organization to the ground. I could have destroyed the protection networks that took you decades to build. I could have done it before you even knew I had these photographs, but I didn't do that. Bumpy leaned forward. His voice was steady, but it carried weight. You came to Harlem asking for a partnership, but a partnership requires equals. And what you just offered me wasn't a partnership. It was a takeover with a smile. It was domination dressed up in the language of cooperation. You wanted control. I'm showing you that I have the power to take everything you have, and I'm not using that power. That's respect. Lucky Luciano set the photograph down slowly. For the first time since Bumpy Johnson entered the room, he looked genuinely impressed. His eyes moved from the photograph to Bumpy's face, and something shifted in his expression. So, he said, what do you want? Bumpy picked up his cigar again. He took a slow drag and let the smoke drift out of his mouth before responding. He was taking his time, allowing the moment to develop, demonstrating control. You want what Schultz wanted, Bumpy said. You want what every Italian crew that's ever looked at Harlem wanted. You want control. You want to own it. You want to be able to say that Harlem belongs to the 5 families. But you can't have it, not because you're not smart enough, not because you're not strong enough. You can't have it because Harlem isn't yours to control. It will never be yours to control. He pointed toward the window, toward the distant glow of lights that marked Harlem in the nighttime skyline. You know why Schultz failed? Bumpy asked. Schultz failed because he thought black people were stupid. He thought we just hand over our money and say thank you, sir, thank you for taking what we built. He thought muscle was enough. He thought that if he showed up with enough guns and enough violence, the community would fold. But Harlem doesn't work that way. Harlem isn't controlled by fear alone. You need trust. You need respect. You need people to understand that the arrangement benefits them, that you're not just taking but giving. You need to be part of the community in some way. You need to be one of us. And Luciano, with all respect, you will never be one of us. Frank Costello started to speak, but Luciano silenced him with a look. Bumpy continued without interruption. But here's what I will do. You asked for 40%. You can have 10. 10% of the net profits, not as protection money, but as a service fee. You provide banking support. We need to move clean money through legitimate channels to pay winners when the heavy numbers hit. You've got the connections to legitimate banks, to savings and loans, to insurance companies. You use those connections for us, and you provide legal help. When our runners get arrested, and they will get arrested sometimes, we need lawyers who can work with judges, who can make arrangements, who can minimize sentences. You provide that service. In return, you get 10% of the monthly net profits. Luciano listened. He did not interrupt. And, one more thing, Bumpy said. His voice had dropped an octave, become more serious. You never, and I mean never, send your soldiers into Harlem to collect our money. You don't send your people into our neighborhood to enforce anything. You don't patrol our streets. Your guns don't show up in Harlem. If you want your 10%, you send a courier to my office, a single man, unarmed. He comes on a specific day at a specific time. I have the money counted, wrapped, and ready. He picks it up, he leaves. But your organization does not operate in Harlem. Harlem stays black. Harlem stays mine. That's the deal. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens when something fundamental has shifted, when the power dynamic has been recalibrated, when everyone in the room understands that they are witnessing something significant. Meyer Lansky was the first to speak. He leaned toward Luciano, his voice quiet so that only a few people could hear. Charlie, he said, using Luciano's nickname, that's actually a smart play. 10% for essentially no risk, no overhead, no exposure. No soldiers in Harlem means no American bodies to explain. It's clean money, it's safe money. And if it goes wrong, it's separated from our operations in a way that protects us. But Anastasia was not convinced. His anger had not fully dissipated. And what's to stop him from cutting us out once we set up the banking infrastructure? Anastasia asked, his voice hostile. Once we've built the connections, once the money starts moving, what's to stop him from deciding he doesn't need us anymore? Bumpy answered before Luciano could speak. The same thing that stops you from trying to take Harlem by force, Bumpy said. Mutual destruction. You try to cheat me, those photographs go public. Your political protection evaporates. The district attorney suddenly starts investigating your organization. Judges start ruling against you. Your banking relationships dry up. I try to cheat you. You come after me with everything you've got. We both understand that. It's a stalemate. In a stalemate, both sides lose or both sides get rich. The choice is yours. Lucky Luciano stared at Bumpy Johnson. He looked at the man sitting across from him, this black man from Harlem who had just, in the space of a conversation, reframed the entire negotiation. A man who had shown him the photographs that could destroy him and then chose not to use them. A man who understood power in a way that transcended race or organized crime structure. A man who understood that the most dangerous threat is not the one you carry out, but the one you hold in reserve. Then, slowly, a genuine laugh emerged from Lucky Luciano. It was not a mocking laugh. It was not a laugh of contempt or dismissal. It was the laugh of a man who recognized genius when he encountered it. You know what, Bumpy? Luciano said, when the laughter had subsided. Schultz was an idiot. He should have talked to you first. I respect that. I respect what you've done here. Luciano stood up. He extended his hand across the table. 10% of the monthly net profits from the Harlem numbers racket. We provide banking support and legal assistance. No soldiers operate in Harlem. Money is delivered monthly to your office by a single, unarmed courier. We have an agreement. You have my word on it. Bumpy stood up as well. He reached across the table and grasped Luciano's hand. It was a firm grip. The grip of two men who had just concluded a significant business transaction. Costello exhaled slowly. Lansky smiled. Even Anastasia, still angry but recognizing that the negotiation was complete, sat back down. The tension that had filled the room began to drain away, replaced by something almost like relief. Luciano continued to hold Bumpy's hand for an extra moment. When he spoke, his voice was genuinely impressed. Let me tell you something, Bumpy Johnson. I've done business with presidents. I've negotiated with police commissioners, union bosses, killers, judges. I've sat across tables from some of the most powerful men in this country, but you're the first man who ever came to my table and told me no without pulling a gun. That takes either incredible guts or incredible stupidity. I haven't decided which one yet. Bumpy smiled. It was a rare smile, genuine and almost warm. When you figure it out, let me know, he said. After his meeting with Lucky Luciano at the Stork Club in 1946, Bumpy Johnson's agreement with the Italian crime families held strong for 22 years. The Harlem Numbers racket flourished under their partnership, with Bumpy faithfully paying 10% monthly to Luciano's organization, while the Italians provided banking, infrastructure, and legal support. When Bumpy was arrested on federal drug charges in 1951 and sentenced to 15 years at Alcatraz, Frank Costello ensured his family was cared for, his wife Mame received anonymous payments, and his children's education was funded. The arrangement remained intact. Upon his release in 1963, after serving 12 years, Bumpy returned to a changed Harlem, shaped by the civil rights movement and the rising drug trade. Yet the original deal persisted until his death in 1968. The Stork Club meeting became legendary in organized crime, not for violence, but for what it represented. Two men from vastly different worlds, separated by race and the rigid hierarchies of 1946, America finding a way to do business as equals. Luciano later described Bumpy as the smartest gangster he ever met, noting that Bumpy's true power lay not in guns or numbers of men, but in his refusal to be anything less than respected. Bumpy kept the photograph of Anastasia in his office for life, not as a threat, but as a silent reminder of a deeper truth, that real power comes from understanding human nature, building trust, and being strategic enough to choose negotiation over violence. Power, Bumpy understood, belongs to those smart enough not to pull the trigger first.